Woke progressives are increasingly freaking out about what they call misinformation, disinformation, and election interference. They histrionically exclaim that free speech and even truth itself are overrated. In today's show, I'll explain what's actually happening and why all of this is fantastic news for America in particular and freedom in general. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branca for Law and Self-Defense, and for those of you who stay to the end, I'll share with you how you can get a free copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, your handbook to being hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. Now, I'm sure that, like me, you've observed woke progressives becoming increasingly unhinged in their exclamations about so-called misinformation, disinformation, and election interference. Indeed, that famous stronghold of conservative philosophy, National Public Radio, recently had its CEO, Catherine Mayer, publicly announce in a talk that truth itself is a bit of a distraction that is preventing us from finding consensus and getting important things done. Listen to her yourself.
I think our reverence for the truth might have become a bit of a distraction that is preventing us from finding consensus and getting important things done.
That's what is sometimes referred to as saying the quiet part out loud. The statement exposes that the progressive left believes that if a policy they consider an important thing, whether that's open national borders, shifting student loan debt onto taxpayers, universal free health care, gun control, legalization of adults sexualizing children, whatever, that is, such policy goals find themselves to be inconsistent with truth, with reality. It is the truth and reality that must be sacrificed in the interest of implementing the progressive policy. I'll say it again. Progressives explicitly believe that even truth and reality themselves must bend the knee to progressive policy goals. Of course, the people making these arguments are invariably sufficiently well off that they don't have to suffer the negative consequences of their progressive policies, inevitably getting their ass beat by truth and reality. They're wealthy enough to live in places immune to the ravages of illegal immigration. They are of the class that makes use of student loans, so it's in their tribe's interest that these loans be paid by other people. They will always have their own access to concierge health care, no matter how badly their free health care policies destroy the system generally, and they can buy costly security services to avoid the ravages that crime inflicts on less wealthy citizens. The rest of us, however, do have to suffer the negative consequences of their failed progressive policies as truth and reality stomp their dreamy fantasies of utopia into the curb with a hobnail boot. The progressives have therefore developed a neat trick to allow them to put their doomed woke policies in place, despite the fact that these policies must necessarily fail with catastrophic effect for the general public. The progressives ensure that the general public is left ignorant of the profound negative consequences their woke policies must necessarily inflict on us, and anyone who is aware of those negative consequences finds their ability to communicate this awareness is ruthlessly crushed. And the progressives are able to do this because they largely control the tools of narrative in our society. What is narrative? Why does it matter? Well, narrative is really just storytelling. Simple enough and familiar to all humans. Indeed, storytelling is as old as humanity itself and is fundamental to how humans tell and explain and share matters of value, both individualistically and societally. Storytelling is fundamentally how humans learn about the world and their place in it. Storytelling is how people learn to evaluate both the current state of the world and their aspirations for the future, their expectations for how their lives and the lives of those they value move forward. Stories shape and define our culture and our satisfaction with that culture. When people believe that their status, resources, and quality of life are aligned with the expectations that result from the stories they've been told, they tend to be generally satisfied with their lives. When people believe that their status, resources, and quality of life are falling well short of their expectations that result from the stories they've been told, they tend to be generally dissatisfied. And dissatisfaction tends to lead to political demands for change. In short, an entire society's population can be led to believe that it is either satisfied or unsatisfied, based less on their objective circumstances and more on whether those circumstances are aligned with the stories they've been told and believed to be true. These stories, these narratives, therefore control everything of political importance in our culture. It was Andrew Breitbart who once noted that politics, meaning of course political elections and the policy choices that result from the winners of those elections, politics is downstream of culture. That is, whoever controls the culture ultimately controls the political outcomes of that culture, controls the culture's political destiny. You can't ultimately win politically if you've lost the culture previously. It's also true, of course, that whoever controls the narrative, the storytelling that defines and frames the culture, controls the culture. And by extension, he who controls the narrative, controls the culture, also controls the politics downstream of both culture and narrative. Now, most normal Americans don't, by default, view the world through this kind of Machiavellian political lens of narrative dominating culture, dominating politics. We're just going about our day, going about our jobs, going to school, taking care of our spouses and kids, participating in our neighborhoods, communities, and churches, maybe looking forward to a Saturday pistol match or the Sunday football game, just living normal lives and hoping mostly to just be left alone. You might have heard of a social sciences concept called the Overton window. This is a way of describing the range of opinions or worldviews that are socially acceptable to hold, even just maybe conventional wisdom, what all right-thinking people believe. Opinions and worldviews that are just outside the Overton window are considered socially unusual or odd, and those that are far outside the Overton window are considered radical or simply unthinkable. Importantly, the Overton window can shift or be shifted so that ideas that were once considered radical have now become acceptable, have now become conventional wisdom. In political combat, it is obviously helpful to have one's own policy goals be considered to fall within the Overton window, and for your political enemy's policy goals to be considered to fall outside the Overton window. Now, because this is the Law of Self-Defense show, I'll use guns and the Second Amendment to illustrate this concept of the Overton window. Only a few decades ago, it was perfectly legal to order firearms through the mail and have them sent directly to your home. There was no such thing as a federal firearms licensee or a gun store through which you had to buy a gun within the limits of your home state. There was no background checks of any kind. That was all perfectly normal, the way things had always been, and well within the Overton window of the time. Today, of course, we live with FFLs and background checks, and our so-called gun violence is worse than ever. But when someone like me suggests that gun background checks are not just facially unconstitutional, but also utterly pointless as a crime prevention measure, because bad guys don't do background checks, and law-abiding people don't need to have them done because they're not criminals, and that therefore there should be no background checks required to purchase a gun, that view is typically received by the general public as radical and well outside today's Overton window, even though it used to be normal. In this example, the Overton window has moved in a direction that's contrary to our Second Amendment rights. At the same time, when I was a young man, there were only a few states that had any provision whatever to allow a private citizen to lawfully carry a concealed firearm for personal protection. In the large majority of states, it was simply illegal to do this, and there was no process by which it could be made lawful. The typical law-abiding, mentally sound American citizen was simply prohibited from carrying a concealed firearm. Today, not only does every state have some means to license private citizens to carry concealed firearms for personal protection, in the majority of the states, they are now constitutional carry. And no permission or licensing is required by the state at all. It's simply lawful to do. In this example, the Overton window has moved in a direction that's consistent with our Second Amendment rights. Now, again, most normal Americans don't spend any time thinking about things like the Overton window, even though the Overton window does function to define the scope of their own opinions they recognize as socially acceptable, and which of their own opinions they know would be seen as radical. And because most Americans aren't consciously aware of the Overton window, that's effectively constraining their own worldview, that Overton window can be used as a narrative weapon against them. And that's exactly what the progressive woke do, because the progressive woke are intensely aware of the power of the Overton window. The progressive woke are well aware that they don't need to silence their political opponents by jailing them or literally gagging them. They can silence their political opponents by simply making the views of those opponents slide outside the Overton window, thereby chilling the expression of those views. A good example of this would be a Make America Great Again ball cap. Less today than previously, but certainly right after Trump was first elected president, there were large parts of the country in which wearing a bright red MAGA cap threatened to result in being physically attacked. Within the context of the Overton window of the times, wearing the MAGA cap was little different from wearing a World War II Nazi uniform, and everybody knows it's not only permissible, but morally virtuous to punch a Nazi. We'll never know how many people were chilled from wearing a MAGA cap, fundamentally a harmless and constitutionally protected expression of political speech, didn't wear the MAGA cap because of a fear of having progressive woke violence visited upon them. But it must surely have numbered in the millions. In other words, by pushing MAGA caps outside the Overton window, the progressive woke effectively chilled the constitutionally protected expression of the political speech of millions of Americans. In fact, the progressive woke are incapable of viewing the world through anything but this Machiavellian political lens of narrative dominating culture, dominating politics, and wielding concepts like the Overton window against their political opponents. Because the prime progressive woke directive in all things is to wield the power to exert political authority over others. The progressive woke are the uber malicious Karen, who absolutely has to be in everybody's business, who is intrinsically unhappy unless she's correcting someone else's behavioral violations, even if she has to create or fabricate new social rules in order to find violations that need correction. Pronouns, anybody? The progressive woke are fundamentally the village scold elected to be HOA president who was also the vice president of human resources. And to the progressive woke, all of us living our normal lives are little more than occasionally useful tax-paying livestock whose proper place in life is under the heel of our progressive woke masters. Naturally, most of us intended to be put under the progressive woke boot would find such a position to be less than desirable, both for ourselves and our loved ones, and we might object. Indeed, in America, it's even possible that the armed population might object rather forcefully. And that's where the progressives have mastered the ultimate power play, their utter domination of societal narrative. Certainly for the first two-thirds of my life, the control of the means of narrative, meaning primarily the media and publishing worlds, and to an increasing extent the brainwashing that occurs during the near mandatory 4-year term of service through an undergraduate program of assimilation, has been thoroughly in control of the progressive woke. People don't know things intuitively. They know information to which they've been exposed, and they interpret that information through the cultural lens that itself is created by the narrative wrapped around that information. So people know things and create a context in which to understand the implications of what they know as a function of the narratives, the stories that deliver them that information and context. Control the narrative, and you control both what people know and how they understand what they know. Fundamentally, you control their culture. And of course, by extension, you then control the political decisions and choices that are likely to be made downstream of their culture. In the last decade or two, these levers of narrative control have reached an entirely new level and become orders of magnitude more powerful because of the capabilities of social media on the internet. Instead of people being subject to narrative influence and control only while reading the morning paper or watching the evening news or reading a progressive-approved novel or being lectured for a few years by progressive woke professors, all of which was surely bad enough, now we're all subject to narrative influence and control nearly every waking second of our lives, thanks to social media and the tiny little brainwashing devices we all carry around in our pockets. Another facet of all this is what used to be called politically correct language, meaning really that there were words and concepts which you were not permitted to speak without risk of social ostracization and perhaps even political cancellation. And often the list of bad words and wrongthink was kept deliberately vague, amorphous, and ever-changing precisely so that it was impossible for even the well-intentioned to keep up. The whole point of having politically correct language was to keep you constantly at social and professional risk and keep your own understanding of the world around you unbalanced. In more recent years, this is perhaps best illustrated with the advent of pronouns and their dozens of variations, permutations, and new creations. Mispronounce someone and you've exposed yourself as a bad person, not worthy of social value. All these changes brought the progressive woke to within inches of absolute narrative control of our society, which, as discussed, would mean also absolute cultural control and therefore absolute political control. Game over. Game over. The progressive woke have won. Bend the knee. They control social media. They can get you canceled or shadow banned. And then the progressive woke experienced an existential crisis. Because for all the control they had over the traditional levers of narrative and therefore culture and therefore politics, they suddenly encountered a force like none other they'd ever seen. And that was Donald J. Trump. Trump's over-the-top personality, his unadulterated love for America, and his own inherent powers of narrative refined over a lifetime of becoming America's perhaps premier commercial negotiator, first threatened and then overcame the progressive woke grasp on narrative control in our nation. And as a result, Trump was elected, shockingly, President of the United States. This gave birth to everything that's come to be known as Trump derangement syndrome, when the progressive woke narrative of their own superiority in inevitable political victory ran headlong into truth and reality. And that's when the nation first began to become aware of the role of narrative in culture and politics, because we all began to see that collectively we were watching two different movies on the same screen. We were all seeing the same things and yet coming to opposite conclusions because we were buying opposite narratives. To provide just one example, the progressive woke heard Trump in Charlottesville speak about the violence over the Confederate statue removals, and they heard him call Nazis good people. In fact, Trump utterly disavowed the white national minority in the crowd at the event, but nothing could break the progressive woke of their desperately clung-to narrative. Still, Trump was president, and his policies were proving both successful and popular. This must not be allowed to stand. Enter COVID, a respiratory virus with 1% the fatality rate of annual seasonal flu, blown up into a fake existential death virus against which the entire global economy must be smashed. Of course, many of us saw COVID for the relatively mild respiratory virus it was and saw no need to destroy the world economy in an effort to do something that had never been accomplished in all of human history, stop the spread of a respiratory virus. A rational approach to COVID would have involved making perhaps heroic efforts to protect the most vulnerable, the elderly and the immunocompromised, and have the rest of the population continue their productive pursuits. When the always questionable COVID vaccine managed to get approved for use in hundreds of millions of humans after a mere year of clinical trials, and then when it became apparent that the vaccine was not a vaccine in any traditional sense of the term, because it did not, in fact, prevent COVID infection, many people asked why we were forcing people to take these injections of these poorly tested, relatively ineffective mRNA concoctions. And what happened to anyone who raised a concern about the COVID policies and mandatory vaccinations, raised concerns contrary to the acceptable COVID narrative within the Overton window of the time? The progressive woke narrative machine went into overdrive to shut those people down. In our modern era, in which most of the population gains access to both information and its context, in other words, where most of the population consumes narrative, the progressive woke drove all narratives contrary to their own policies out of the realm of public discourse. Most of you listening to me who were actively speaking on these matters at the time on social media found yourselves shadow banned, the reach of your accounts squelched, your accounts suspended, or even permanently banned. Indeed, President Trump himself, while still president, would find himself widely banned from social media, including the largest platforms such as X, then Twitter, and Facebook. And with that, the progressive woke took a lock on narrative, and thereby culture, and thereby politics. The following election was stolen from Trump through the creation of 20 million Democrat votes, never to be seen in an election again, and Joe Biden was elected president. By the way, anyone who suggested on social media at the time that Biden had stolen the election was quickly subject to narrative control, with shadow banning, suspension, and banning of their social media accounts. So again, that was it. The progressive woke battle for control of narrative and culture and politics was won. With Biden in office, the progressive woke could and did federally prosecute their political enemies, including both protesters and President Trump himself, as well as many of Trump's highest political allies. The progressives also began to import tens of millions of third world migrants into the United States, whose presence and reliable Democrat political leanings alone ensured enormous electoral college advantage for the progressives. Even worse, the progressives began to aggressively fast-track these third world migrants into becoming American citizens. Had that occurred, there would never again have been anything that could be fairly termed an American election. This time, the progressive woke knew they had the victory locked in, and once again, it was game over, man. Game over. Bake my cake, loser, or suffer the consequences. And then the entire narrative table got turned over again. Elon Musk bought Twitter, renamed it X, and opened the floodgates to free speech and discourse. Suddenly, the progressive woke control of the levers of narrative and culture and politics once again faced an existential threat, and another COVID play wasn't likely in the cards. Musk had recognized the narrative paradigm I've been talking about. He saw that if the progressive woke won the 2024 presidential election, that there would never again be anything that could be fairly termed an American election. He saw that the politics of the election was downstream of American culture, and that American culture was downstream of the nation's narrative, and he therefore purchased control of perhaps the most powerful form for social media narrative creation, Twitter, now X. Musk promptly fired the censoring senior management of Twitter, fired the overwhelming majority of the progressive woke staff, and had his own programmers work their way through the code and both discover and eradicate hard-coded progressive woke censorship paradigms throughout the platform. Musk also restored large numbers of accounts that had been previously banned or shadow banned, including notably the banned account of President Trump himself. And the shaping of the American narrative once again became a competitive battlefield in which both sides were permitted to make their arguments. And Donald Trump was, again, elected president for a third time, and in a few days from now will be sworn in as president for a second term. Perhaps most important, it looks like Elon's acquisition and reform of X and the election of Trump have now begun a narrative cascade that presents as an existential threat to everything progressive woke, which I'll remind you cannot itself stand against truth and reality. Just this past week, arguably the second most powerful social media platform in the world, Facebook, really the broader Meta group that also controls Instagram, had its owner, Mark Zuckerberg, announce that he was firing that platform's massive 40,000-person censorship team and replacing it with a far less doctrinal community note scheme similar to what Elon had put in place at X. Now the progressive woke had lost control of the presidency as well as the U.S. House and Senate, and they had lost control of the two most powerful narrative forces in the United States and arguably the world, X and Meta. Now it is the progressive woke who are shrieking in histrionic agony, "Game over, man, game over." The horror. With the loss of narrative control, they see their loss of cultural control. And with the loss of cultural control comes the loss of political control. and the loss of all their most valued political goals and policies. They see their power to subject us to their will evaporating before their eyes. With the loss of narrative control in culture and politics, it became inevitable that the national borders would be secured, that their hoped-for replacement of Americans with third-world migrants would be brought to an end. It became inevitable that middle-class graduates of trade schools were not going to be compelled to pay off the student loans of gender studies graduate students. It became clear that the ability to compel American working families to pay outsized health insurance bills in order to provide free health care to illegal aliens would be threatened. Certainly, gun control would continue to suffer political loss after political loss. And adults interested in sexualizing our children would find their mission greatly complicated. Those and every other progressive woke mandate and policy goal was about to be strangled in its crib by reality and truth, by the progressive woke loss of the control of narrative and culture and politics, and good riddance. So when you see progressives today shrieking about purported misinformation and disinformation, when you hear their narrative enemies, us, being labeled as radical or nationalists or racist or Russian colluders or election interferers or vaccine deniers, when you hear them characterize Elon Musk and now Mark Zuckerberg as a threat to democracy itself, when they lose their minds because social media platforms have moved away from staffs of tens of thousands to censor thoughts and arguments and opinions they deem to fall outside of the progressive woke Overton window. And when you hear the CEO of NPR, National Public Radio, speak openly and publicly about how truth itself is a mere distraction, preventing the progressive woke from getting their policies achieved, know that these are all just the flailing of a mortally wounded ideological monster into whose guts has been driven the metaphorical narrative spear of those who value and love truth and reality and freedom and America. And again, good riddance to it. And when some progressive woke fascist is trying to control your personal narrative by telling you what words you must say, what pronouns you must use, and what words you must not say, I mean, surely you're a horrible racist for believing that America should prioritize the interest of Americans over third world migrants, right? When they try to assert control over your personal narrative, know that they are in fact asserting control over your personal liberty and your ability to influence the culture and politics that determine the potential and quality of life of not only yourself, but everyone you care about. The progressive woke hate you. They hate yours. And they want nothing less than to see you and everything you care about forced to submit to their malicious, hate-filled whims. The good news is, just as Hitler couldn't invade England without control of the channel, the progressives can't submit Americans until and unless they have control of the narrative. And it's beginning to look like they might have lost narrative control for good. As Elon likes to say, you are the media. You are the narrative creators now. Don't let this unique opportunity to control your personal narrative rest unused. Really, I suggest it's not just an opportunity, it's a moral obligation, a duty to wield your narrative power against these progressive woke who would use their own malicious woke narrative to destroy you and yours. I know that most of you just want to go about your lives without engaging in political narrative combat and aren't much interested in the progressive woke. But I can assure you that the progressive woke are deeply interested in you and your ability to just go about your life, and they simply will not allow it. The political narrative combat is happening whether you want it or not. And while we could still lose that narrative combat, even if we do fight, we'll certainly lose if we don't fight. Okay, folks, before I wrap up, I do want to share with you how you can get a free copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, your handbook to being hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. We translate all the legalese into plain English so you can make better informed, more confident, more legally sound, and more decisive decisions in defense of what you value most. And perhaps best of all, most people tell us they can read the entire book in less than an afternoon. Check the book out on Amazon where it's 5-star rated, but don't buy it there. They'll charge you $25 for the book, plus shipping and handling. Order the book from us, and we only ask that you cover the cost of shipping the book to you. The book itself is free. Get your free copy of The Law of Self-Defense Principles right now at lawofselfdefense.com/free book. I'll close out by reminding all of you that if you carry a gun, so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun, so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to know the law, so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca at lawofselfdefense.com. Stay safe.